Hi, Laurence. We are on air. We are today talking about the influence of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict on the future of Armenia and Artsakh. In other words, how is and how will the conflict shape the future of Armenia and Artsakh? And let's start with a phrase, an opinion which can be very often heard in Armenia and Artsakh these days. Many people say that the war is not over yet. How will you comment on this opinion, and what can it mean from the point of view of the future? What future does this statement promise to us? The floor is yours.
Well, I think I would agree. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today. It's a privilege and an honor. I think I would agree with the assessment that, what we've seen over the last 3 months and the outcome of the 10th of November trilateral declaration is nobody's best case scenario. Not even for Azerbaijan, not for Russia, arguably with Turkey. Perhaps Turkey is the party that gains the most, strategically speaking. The trilateral declaration, of course, brings in a number of measures in the fields of security and transit. And therefore, a common narrative is that this is, in a sense, an implementation of the basic principles which were under negotiation since the mid-2000s. But obviously, the core issue that is contested between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, is not present in the trilateral declaration and has been, in a sense, very explicitly taken off the agenda. President Ilham Aliyev has said that he doesn't want to see negotiations on status, but it's very difficult to see a normalization of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan without this issue being resolved or settled in one way or another. So in that sense, I would agree the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict lives on because the core issue that's at stake is not resolved.
So basically, if we're talking about the future, it means that we are still in the conflict, quite very much in the conflict, aren't we?
Yes, I mean, I think this has been, in so many ways, a crushing defeat for Armenia. Yet it's not a total defeat. And by the same token, it is a very significant military victory for Azerbaijan, but it's not total. Because the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh and this, anomalous territory still exists physically, militarily, as a distinct space with a distinct security regime. And in a sense, we're kind of in a replay of the situation from the mid-1990s. In 1994, Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh won a stunning military victory, but that was not the resolution of the conflict. The way in which the victory was won imported a whole set of new issues, complicating the mediation process. And I think in some ways we see a similar dynamic today where there are all kinds of new elements that have come into the conflict. So an already complicated conflict now has additional layers on top, making its resolution and mediation even more complex than they were before.
Now, you have mentioned a couple of times already the word of security. And for Armenians, I would say for every Armenian, wherever he or she is in the world, came forward quite a serious security problem, especially after Turkey took part in the Karabakh War. Now, Armenia is the smallest country in the region and has no oil and gas, which makes the problem of security more important because oil and gas, they bring money, and money brings additional levels of security. How would you see this problem? How can we deal with that? I mean, with this lack of security? Shall we live on with this lack of security, or, for example, turn to Russia to seek a bit more secure future in the short term, at least?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the issue of security, or the problem of insecurity, remains center stage, and in many ways has become even more acute. In contrast to the situation before the 10th of November, Armenians are no longer responsible for their own security in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Russian peacekeeping forces, Russia now has effectively a kind of monopoly on the security of the Karabakh Armenian population. And as you mentioned, Mark, the much more explicit presence and participation of Turkey has driven fears regarding the future of Syunik province, the possibility that there could be instability surrounding that piece of Armenia that intercedes between Azerbaijan and its exclave in Nakhchivan. And I think in the short to medium term, it's hard to see an alternative to the traditional strategy of balancing with Russia. Armenia has been in this asymmetric rivalry with Azerbaijan for all of these years. And one of the coping mechanisms or strategies has been to balance with Russia. I think there's been, in many ways, a rude awakening that Russia's military support or extended security umbrella to Armenia has only applied to the Republic of Armenia itself, has not applied to Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic as it existed prior to November. So in the short to medium term, for as long as we are talking about a hard concept of security, there are few options other than balancing with more powerful outsiders. I think
excuse me for interrupting you. Please don't forget your thought. But now Turkey has jumped into the picture. And if we have Armenia and sort of Russia, which is balancing Armenia's security element, there is Turkey, which also openly, explicitly speaks about, invading Syunik province and even Yerevan, which brings the security problem of Armenia to a more serious level.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think what we've seen, the outcome of this war, is the regionalization of this conflict. The conflict is no longer the object of a multilateral diplomatic process led by a coalition of outside states seeking to resolve the conflict. It's become a regionalized theater for some competition, some cooperation between aspiring regional powers, Russia and Turkey. And that, of course, makes the security dynamic and the potential for new polarity, new rivalry, even sharper. And this is in a context where Turkish support to Azerbaijan has, in a sense, been more reliable and more comprehensive in many ways than Russia's support to Armenia, or at least how that support was understood and anticipated in Armenia. And I think in the long term, what we need is a different concept of security, a much softer concept that draws not on hard security measures, but on the soft infrastructure that would, in a sense, bind the different states and communities of the South Caucasus together in a new regional design. Now, some people argue that we see elements in that direction in the Trilateral Declaration, in terms of new transit corridors, opening up new commerce opportunities and so on. But for that to really become the basis for a kind of a new kind of interdependency and a shared concept of security, you need to transform relations. And so hence the importance of continued dialogue to move on from a very hard concept of security that is so easily manipulated as well by outside parties.
Now, when you say new regional design of security, we can very easily see that it also includes Azerbaijan and Turkey. Now, to talk to any Armenian anywhere in the world about a situation when the security of Armenia is sort of interrelated with Azerbaijan and Turkey is useless. I mean, no Armenian ever in the world would understand a new concept of security when we are dependent on Azerbaijan and Turkey. And the opposite question immediately comes to mind. Isn't it better to stick with Russia?
Well, I would agree in the sense that if Armenia is looking at security patrons, there isn't an alternative to Russia at present. But the experience shows that that relationship has not prevented a major conflict with very dire consequences for Armenia. So I guess my argument is that, yes, in the short to medium term, one has to be a realist and recognize that there aren't, many alternative sources of patronage. But over the longer term, one can think about, a much more diversified approach to Armenian foreign policy that would look beyond the traditional Europe-Eurasia polarity and binary, something that could be framed as complementarity 2.0, looking at other potential partners, other kinds of relationship, both within the context of the South Caucasus. So, the relationships with Georgia and Iran, each of which has its own problems, but also looking beyond the Caucasus to new kinds of relationship and foreign policy interest for Armenia, contributing, I think, to a wider sense of security beyond what the immediate developments in the South Caucasus itself.
If our interview was, say, half a year ago, I would say that the independence of Armenia is a value of the highest level. Now, today, I can hear many voices in Armenia speaking that, when we are talking about our physical security, we should better rethink the idea of independence. And I mean, I hear these voices here and there. The way you suggest, your suggestions about the security are all based on the existing independence of Armenia. Don't you see this sort of threat for a medium to long-term future?
The threat that Armenia would cease to be independent?
Yes.
Well, I acknowledge that there are debates on this in Armenia, and it is something that is experienced as a real threat. I would very much hope that threat doesn't materialize, and I think in terms of the paths forward, I think there have also been discussions about a possible pathway to becoming a garrison state for Armenia, responding to this security threat through much increased investment in military capacity, increased emphasis on military self-sufficiency, and so on. I would contrast that with an alternative pathway, if you will, which is to really focus on building the constitutional state in Armenia, focusing on the governance values that achieved a broad consensus at the time of the Velvet Revolution in April and May 2018, and essentially, making the building of a constitutional state as the ultimate value and guarantor of Armenian security. I think we are seeing a particularly conflictual moment in world relations, where Azerbaijan and Turkish dynamics have kind of cohered into a moment that has very serious implications for Armenia. But both of these states are also themselves going to evolve. And so I'm a bit cautious about the framing of certain nations or states as eternal enemies and friends, because I think that also, in a sense, can limit the policy options I know that's probably not a popular view right now, but ultimately, however unimaginable that seems today, the security of Armenia would best be served through processes of normalization. So I know that, there are almost, it seems today, insurmountable obstacles on the path to such a normalization. But over the long term, I would see that as ultimately underwriting perhaps a new security paradigm in the South Caucasus.
And if we're talking about long-term perspective, we also should think about, say, post-Erdogan and post-Aliyev Turkey and Azerbaijan, because they will also change. And at this very moment, we don't know in which way will they change. But we can also at least think about that and have that in mind.
Yes, and of course, Russia will also change. And one of the features of this trilateral declaration, in a sense, and this whole new status quo that we see today, is in some sense a product of a specific conjuncture of personalities as well as geopolitical tendencies on a global scale. And so, one of the dilemmas, in a sense, is to think about, the role of institutions, and to focus on those institutions that Armenia does have control and influence over, so its own state institutions. So in a sense, one way to respond to all of this is really to double down on reform, on democratization, on participation, on meeting the representational demand that I see as a consistent feature of Armenian politics since independence, and since before independence, even if the surrounding environment is inhospitable.
Now, what you say also would bring us from the paradigm of survival to a paradigm of development, if I understand you rightly.
Yes, I mean, obviously, I acknowledge that I'm speaking sort of on mid to long term perspectives that right now probably seem pie in the sky fantasy. Armenia right now is in survival mode. It's traumatized. There are ongoing, really distressing events that are accompanying the aftermath of this war and keeping the trauma alive. And so I think it is very difficult at a time like this to talk about pragmatism, to talk about practical visions going forward.
Now, you said the word trauma. And, it was a very traumatic experience for all of us. Plus, we already have another trauma which hasn't been healed since 1915. So isn't it a bit too much for a nation? I mean, being traumatized so many times throughout quite a short period of time. And you probably should know other examples of nations, of states which were traumatized and were able to overcome it. Mm-hmm. So let's talk on examples. Who did what?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that Serbia is another country that has repeatedly experienced defeats and the losses of territories that it considers to be part of the Serbian heartland. And yet, we do see, however problematically, a shift away from that paradigm. And so I think part potentially of addressing the issue of trauma is, first of all, to reassess the expectations and assumptions that predominated in Armenian nationalism and in Armenian geopolitical culture, and which, in a sense, what role did those play in arriving at the situation that we have today. And I mean, I've written about this in my work. I've contrasted this notion of the constitutional state with a national space, a space that included as a single unit the Republic of Armenia, the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, and the surrounding occupied territories, and that was problematic. And I think one of the issues, or one of the questions that I have in conversations with Armenians is the absence of an internal critique of occupation and the consequences of occupation for state building. Now,
probably that lack of internal critique comes also from the fact that we never called these territories occupied. We always called them liberated.
Yes. So Azatagurvats Taraskner was the term. But this was a movement. Originally, these territories were referred to as a security belt, as a buffer zone. And I remember that it was in the late 2000s, around about 2010, I could be wrong on that. This was the moment when liberated territories became the normal term. And it became very difficult to question that and to say, hang on a minute, these territories were not part of the original dispute. And yet they bring, a lot of complicating factors into the situation. So I think a reassessment and a really self-critical perspective, and I know that's very hard. You're talking about being in a state of trauma. And I think the other element here is not to make that internal self-critique contingent on seeing the same process on the other side of the divide. You need to look at these issues for the health and well-being of your own community without it being dependent on seeing reciprocal steps. And I appreciate that, to talk about, an internal dialogue on, things that were done in the past without seeing that same process on the other side of a divide can seem counterintuitive and can seem, in a sense, unhealthy. But I really think it's about you take responsibility for your own narrative and your own memory, in a sense, rather than displacing that responsibility by saying, well, we can only, unravel these issues. We can only uncover these very difficult questions if we see the same process going on the other side.
Now I have another question also related to the conflict. In one of your books, you called yourself a peace-building practitioner. How do you see the future from this point of view? Because in this case, we can state that peace-building has failed, hasn't it?
Well, I think that's the very widespread narrative. Peace building has failed, militarization has won. I mean, there's a number of ways to answer that. I would say, first of all, as we were talking earlier, a military solution is not a resolution of the conflict. It simply produces a new status quo. Secondly, peace building practitioners at the civil society level were not responsible for solving the conflict. That was the mandate of the leaderships of Armenia and Azerbaijan, who, as you know, had many years of a very circular, meandering route through the Minsk process, and there were opportunities. Geray Libaridzian in particular has written on this, I think, very cogently, very eloquently, that there were moments in the past when more could have been gained in terms of making an agreement from a position of strength rather than the position that Armenia is in today and as a result of this war. So in that sense, I recognize that to talk about peace building right now is very complex, and the environment is not conducive to that. But if we understand peace building as a broad agenda for progressive change, for participatory change, I think we can see a number of ways forward. The purpose of peacebuilding practitioners right now may not be to engage in cross-divide dialogue. It may be to ensure that those communities that are most affected by what's just happened have a voice in rehabilitation, reconstruction, and the reconstitution of political communities. And I think as a precursor to cross-divide dialogue, one urgent priority is for increased national level dialogue amongst all the different positions and voices to make sense of what has just happened. And I think that is a need across the divide.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, but I still have several questions that were sent to you by, the Facebook commentators who saw the announcement of our
Yes.
talk. And one question is, it was sent just during our conversation. I'll read it now. How do you assess the real effective non-verbal initiative of the US and Europe in suspending the war in Artsakh in the fall of 2020? I sincerely don't know what the author of the question means by non-verbal initiative in suspending the war, but isn't there too much political hypocrisy in their approach to supporting the democratic regime in the Republic of Armenia?
I mean, I think these questions are getting at the failure of Euro-Atlantic actors to have a voice, to take action during the conflict, and I want to acknowledge that. I think there's been a huge breakdown in what you might call relational trust, a trust that proceeds from a relationship and assumptions of that relationship. Amongst Armenians looking at the EU, looking at the US. Part of this is due to the timing of the conflict. There was immense distraction across the world. But I think also there has been a lack of focus, a lack of attention, and a kind of abdication of responsibility. And I think, going forward, one way to start repairing that relationship perhaps is to shift to a more transactional concept of trust. We need to work out our relationship again, in a sense, from a clean slate. And I think absolutely Euro-Atlantic actors need to be very humble as they re-engage with this conflict. I would just say that it's been very frustrating for many years to be in different forums in the US and in Europe saying that this conflict needs attention, that this is not a stable situation.
We were on many of these forums together.
Yes, yes. And right now, in November and December, there has been, a non-stop stream of brainstorming events and meetings to discuss this, closing the door after the horse has bolted, as we say in English. And I think that's, really a regrettable situation. And for this reason, I think that's why I was suggesting Armenia needs to kind of break out, in a sense, of the Eurasia-Europe dichotomy, to look around and reassess its own strategic priorities and possibilities. What I would finish that point, though, by saying that the EU and Europe more generally, I think, will remain engaged. And what it offers, in a sense, is a non-hegemonic form of regionalism. Mm-hmm. The EU doesn't seek to dominate. It doesn't come with sticks. It comes more with carrots. Perhaps in the short term, these need to be transactionally understood, but I very much hope that a new relational kind of trust can be rebuilt over the mid to long term.
Well, yes, and especially when we have other regional powers which are coming with sticks and not carrots. There is one question which I'm not sure this question is within your professional interests, but I think we still can talk about it. It says, how to develop a strong national elite. And I believe it's also an issue for the future nation building and a future sort of reassessing ourselves after the humiliation of the war.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's a very interesting question because the history of the Armenian political elite has been, in a sense, a very up and down and diverse one, and I think there is a basic schism uh, between sort of a constitutional elite and an oligarchic elite. And I think for as long as you have a place within the elite for oligarchic type figures, then the Armenian political elite, I think, will continue to not to be as strong as it otherwise might be. I mean, I think I would just answer that question by reiterating the need to focus on the constitutional state, on the values of skilled and emancipated sovereign citizens who will expect more from their elites and who, moving through reformed institutions, could become members of that elite, focused most of all on constitutional values and not on the private values that encroach upon public space and the role of public law. So I think, managing that and containing the tendency of private interests to encroach on public space would be the key to a stronger elite.
There is another question, and I believe you have also already answered this question, and it is, where shall we start the formation of a national goal? I believe when you were talking about these constitutional values, you were talking about a new system of values and a new system of reaching them as an important national goal, didn't you?
Yes, I mean, I'm very wary of national goals, national missions. I'm living in a country that has designed for itself, has thought up for itself a new national mission, which is to become global Britain, separate from Europe, engaging in a sort of a fantasy about itself as a former colonial power, kind of looking back to a golden age and trying to, extrapolate that into the future. I would see the building of a truly constitutional state where rights and freedoms are protected. That is the highest possible goal, and that is the highest value of any state, without having a romantic or idealistic goal attached to it.
Thank you very much. I think this is the moment when we can, end up with our conversation. Our conversation today, within the framework of the talks about the future, was a British expert, political scientist, and peacekeeping practitioner, Laurence Broers. And thank you very much, Laurence. Let's hope that we had an interesting conversation.
My thanks to you, Mark, for the invitation, and thank you to the Future Studio for inviting me. Thank you very much.